The first question my son-in-law asked after my wife's funeral wasn't about how I was doing. It wasn't about whether I was eating. It wasn't even about his wife, my daughter. He looked across my kitchen table, wrapped both hands around a coffee mug that had belonged to my wife for almost 30 years, and asked, "So, what are your plans for the cabin?" If stories about family secrets, quiet betrayals, and the choices that change generations keep you listening, subscribe. There is always another truth waiting at the end. For a few seconds, I simply looked at him. Not because I didn't hear the question, because I had. Perfectly. The house was still filled with sympathy flowers. Half the casseroles neighbors had dropped off were untouched in the refrigerator. My wife's coat still hung beside the back door because I hadn't found the strength to move it. And somehow, the cabin was already on his mind. I answered the only way I could. "I'm not making any plans." He smiled politely. I didn't call Ethan. I didn't accuse Claire. Instead, I asked Martin to arrange one meeting. Just the three of us. Me, Martin, and Claire. Not Ethan. She arrived at Martin's office the following Thursday. The moment she walked in, she looked confused. "Dad, what's going on?" I stood and hugged her. "I need you to hear something before anyone else tells you their version." Martin waited until we both sat down. Then he placed a single folder on the table. "This concerns the cabin." Claire looked from him to me. "I don't understand." "I know," I said quietly. "That's why we're here." Martin opened the folder. "Years ago, your mother and father created a legal plan for the property." Claire frowned. "I've never seen this." "You weren't supposed to." "Why not?" I took a slow breath. "Because your mother believed there might come a day when someone would see the cabin as land instead of home." Her eyes filled with confusion. Martin explained everything. The ownership, the protective structure, the instructions Evelyn had left. Most importantly, nothing could be sold. Nothing could be transferred. Nothing could be used as collateral. Not while I was alive. And even afterward, the property would pass to Claire separately, protected from future marital claims. When Martin finished, the room became completely silent. Claire stared at the papers, then she whispered, "He knew." I didn't answer. He knew there had to be something. Still, I said nothing. Slowly, she looked up. "He kept asking me to find out if you had already signed anything." My heart sank. I thought he was just trying to help. "I know." He even asked if I could take pictures whenever I visited the cabin. Martin and I exchanged a quick glance. Claire noticed. "What?" I looked at her carefully. "Someone has already been inspecting the property." Her face lost its color. "What?" "They've been talking about future development." She covered her mouth with one hand. "No. I wish I were wrong." Tears finally rolled down her cheeks. I told him where the old access road was. The words came out barely above a whisper. I didn't think it mattered. I reached across the table and took her hand. "You didn't know." I helped him. "No." I squeezed her hand gently. "You trusted your husband." "Those aren't the same thing." She cried quietly for another minute. Then she asked the question I had been expecting. "What happens now?" I looked at Martin, then back at my daughter. "Now. You decide what kind of marriage you want to have." 3 weeks later, Claire called. "I've moved into a furnished apartment." She sounded exhausted, but peaceful. I told Ethan I wanted honesty. And? He admitted he'd already spoken with the developer. I closed my eyes. What did he say? He said the cabin was wasted potential. She stopped for a moment. That's when I realized he never saw what Mom saw. The following Monday, Martin called me one last time. The developer has withdrawn. Why? They finally received copies of the legal documents. And? Martin smiled. They discovered the land was never available in the first place. I looked out my kitchen window. For months, everyone had been chasing something they believed they could own. The only person who had understood its true value had planned everything years before. The divorce became final the following winter. There wasn't a dramatic courtroom scene. No shouting, no public accusations, just paperwork, signatures, and two people walking away from a marriage that had quietly stopped being built on trust. Ethan never contacted me again. Martin later told me his attorney had made one last attempt to question the legal structure protecting the cabin. The answer was simple. Everything had been prepared years before. Everything had been done correctly. The matter ended there. No lawsuit, no settlement. Just the end of a conversation that should never have started. Spring arrived early. One Saturday morning, Claire called. "Are you going to the cabin?" "I was just packing. Mind if I come?" "I was hoping you would." She arrived carrying 2 grocery bags and a homemade apple pie, for the first time in months. She smiled without forcing it. The drive north felt different. There was no tension between us anymore. Only quiet, the kind that exists between people who no longer have anything to hide. The cabin looked exactly as it always had. The same weathered porch, the same squeaky screen door, the same white coffee mug waiting beside the old stove. Claire picked it up and smiled. Mom never let anyone else use this one. No. She said coffee tasted better in it. It probably did. We laughed. A real laugh. The first we'd shared since Evelyn's funeral. That afternoon, we walked the shoreline together. The ice was gone. The lake reflected the blue sky so clearly, it almost looked like another world beneath the surface. Claire stopped near the old dock. "I used to think this place would always stay exactly the same." "It won't," she nodded. "I know. The roof will need replacing. The dock too," she smiled. "But that's different." "It is." She looked across the water. "I finally understand what Mom was protecting. It wasn't the land." I shook my head. "No. It was the chance to come back here without anyone telling us what it should become." I felt something loosen inside me. Not relief. Something quieter than that. Peace, perhaps. Before we left, I unlocked the small wooden cabinet beside the fireplace. From the back, I took out an old brass key attached to a faded blue ribbon. Claire looked at it. "I remember that. Your mother tied that ribbon herself." I placed the key in her hand. "It doesn't change who owns the cabin." She looked at me, confused. "Then why give it to me now?" "Because ownership isn't what your mother wanted you to inherit." She waited. "She wanted you to know there will always be one place where you belong." Claire closed her fingers around the key. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. As the sun began to set, we locked the cabin and walked slowly toward the truck. Halfway there, Claire looked back one last time. "I think Mom would like today." I smiled. "I think she'd tell us to stop standing around and get home before dark." Claire laughed. She probably would. We climbed into the truck. In the rearview mirror, the cabin grew smaller with every turn in the road. But somehow, it no longer felt like something we were leaving behind. It felt like something that would always be waiting for us. The old coffee mug was still on the kitchen shelf. The brass key rested safely in Claire's coat pocket. and for the first time in a long while, that was enough. Sure, I just meant eventually. Eventually. Funny word. People use it when they want something now but don't want to sound impatient. My daughter Claire looked uncomfortable. She reached for her coffee without saying anything. She knew me well enough to recognize the silence that meant I was thinking instead of speaking. Her husband, Ethan, mistook it for hesitation. You know, he continued, properties like that can be expensive to maintain. I've managed for 38 years. I'm just saying, I know what you're saying. The room became very quiet. Outside, February wind pushed loose snow across the backyard. The old maple tree scraped softly against the fence. Claire finally spoke. Dad, Ethan is only trying to help. I nodded. I'm sure he thinks he is. I changed the subject. We talked about the drive home, about the weather, about whether the roads would freeze overnight. By 7 o'clock, they left. Claire hugged me tightly. Longer than usual. Ethan shook my hand. His grip was confident, almost rehearsed. As their SUV disappeared down the street, I stood on the porch much longer than I needed to. The porch light reflected off fresh snow. For the first time since my wife passed away, I remembered something she had said nearly 2 years earlier. If anyone suddenly becomes interested in the cabin after I'm gone, she had smiled sadly. Promise me you'll wait before you answer. At the time I laughed. Who would suddenly become interested? She never laughed back. You'd be surprised. My name is Thomas Mercer. I'm 68 years old. I spent most of my career repairing commercial refrigeration systems across northern Minnesota. Not glamorous work, but honest work. The kind where people only notice you when something stops working. My wife, Evelyn, taught 3rd grade for almost 30 years. She believed every child deserved one adult who never gave up on them. Sometimes I think that's why Claire became the woman she did. Patient, kind, always assuming the best about people, even when they hadn't earned it. Especially then. Evelyn had been gone for just over 6 weeks. Pancreatic cancer. 14 months from diagnosis to goodbye. Near the end, she stopped worrying about herself. Instead, she worried about what would happen after. Not to me, to Claire. One evening while snow fell outside the hospital window, she reached for my hand. I need one promise. You don't have to ask. You haven't heard it. I'll still say yes. She smiled. You always were stubborn. Then she became serious. Don't let anyone rush you after I'm gone. I won't. And don't let anyone convince Claire that memories are just assets. I frowned. What does that mean? She looked toward the window. I think you'll understand later. I didn't. Not then. The cabin sat beside Pine Hollow Lake about 3 hours north of Duluth. It wasn't large. 1 bedroom, a sleeping loft, old pine walls, a stone fireplace, the same screen door that had squeaked since Ronald Reagan was president. Evelyn inherited it from her grandmother before we were married. Every July we spent 2 weeks there. Claire learned to swim there, learned to fish there, learned how to make pancakes on an old cast-iron stove there. The place never cared how much money we had. It looked exactly the same whether our checking account held $200 or $2,000. People think valuable property always looks expensive. Sometimes it just looks loved. 3 weeks after the funeral, Claire called. Dad, can we come by Sunday? Of course. Ethan has an idea. That sentence sat strangely with me, not because of the words, because of the pause before them. When people believe in what they're about to say, They don't usually hesitate. Sunday afternoon, they arrived carrying cinnamon rolls from a bakery Claire liked. We ate together, talked about ordinary things, neighbors, her job at the hospital, a new puppy belonging to the family across the street. Then Ethan cleared his throat. I've been looking into estate planning. There it was again. Estate. Planning. Words that had started appearing far too often. I'm listening. You shouldn't have to deal with everything alone. I manage. I know. He leaned forward. But paperwork gets complicated. What paperwork? The house. My retirement. The cabin. He said that last word carefully, like someone placing a chip in the middle of a poker table. I watched Claire. She wasn't looking at me. She was staring into her coffee. I was thinking, Ethan continued, maybe we should make a complete inventory of everything. Why? So there aren't surprises later. I smiled politely. I don't believe there are any surprises. He smiled back. You'd be amazed how often families discover property they forgot to mention. Forgot. Interesting choice of word. I had never forgotten the cabin. Neither had Claire. She spent half her childhood there. So why say forgotten? I let the conversation drift somewhere else, but something inside me had quietly shifted. That evening I opened the hall closet. On the top shelf sat an old metal box. Inside were decades of papers, insurance policies, marriage certificates, receipts, and one cream-colored envelope with Evelyn's handwriting. Only 4 words. Not until necessary. I looked at it for a long time. Then I put it back exactly where it had been. I still believed there was time. I had no idea someone else had already started asking questions about the cabin. The first strange thing wasn't a phone call. It wasn't a letter. It wasn't even Ethan. It was a set of fresh tire tracks leading toward the cabin before the snow had finished falling. I found them on the second Saturday in March. Winter had started letting go, but not gracefully. The roads north were still lined with dirty snowbanks, and Pine Hollow Lake remained frozen except for a narrow strip of dark water near the reeds. I always made the first trip of the season alone. It had become a habit years earlier. I would check the roof, start the generator, walk the shoreline, make sure mice hadn't found their way inside. It made me feel like I was waking the place up after a long sleep. The cabin looked exactly the way I'd left it in October. The shutters were secure, the windows untouched. The old wind chime Evelyn had insisted on hanging beside the porch still moved softly in the cold breeze. For a moment I smiled. Then I noticed the tracks. They weren't mine. A pickup had driven in from the old logging road behind the property. Almost nobody used that road anymore. It wasn't maintained by the county. Most people didn't even know it existed. The truck had stopped near the eastern property line, not beside the cabin, not near the dock, near the trees. I stood there for several seconds. The engine had been turned off. Someone had stayed long enough to leave footprints, large boots, back and forth, almost as if they'd been measuring something. I didn't panic. 35 years repairing equipment had taught me one thing. If something doesn't make sense, look longer before you react. I took pictures with my phone, the tracks, the footprints, the tire tread. Then I walked the entire property. Nothing appeared stolen. Nothing was broken. Still, the quiet felt different, as though someone had been looking at the cabin instead of visiting it. On the drive home, I called the only person besides Evelyn who knew everything. Martin Rhodes, our attorney. He had handled our wills for nearly 20 years. Martin answered on the second ring. Tom? Sorry to bother you on a Saturday. You never bother me. I told him about the tracks. He didn't interrupt once. When I finished, he asked a single question. Has Claire mentioned the cabin recently? A few times. And Ethan? More than a few. Silence. Finally he spoke. Drive safely. Come see me Monday. Martin's office overlooked the Mississippi River in downtown St. Cloud. Same building, same leather chairs, same old grandfather clock in the reception area that somehow always seemed 5 minutes slow. He greeted me with coffee already waiting. You look tired. I didn't sleep much. I expected as much. He closed his office door before sitting down. You remember what Evelyn asked us to prepare? I nodded. I remember. He opened a blue folder, not thick, maybe 20 pages. Most of them I had signed years ago. I've reviewed everything again. And legally nothing has changed. He tapped one document. The cabin is fully protected. I frowned. You sound like you're answering a question I didn't ask. Martin smiled slightly. Because I think I know the question you're avoiding. I waited. You want to know if someone could pressure Claire into asking for something that isn't actually available. I leaned back. I don't want to believe that's what's happening. I know. But your wife planned for possibilities. He slid the folder toward me. You still control everything. I know. No transfer. No sale. No refinancing. No signatures. Nothing happens unless you decide. I let out a slow breath. So we're safe. Martin looked directly at me. The paperwork is safe. He paused. People are another matter. For several weeks, nothing happened. Or at least, nothing obvious. Claire called every Wednesday. She had done that for years. Now she also called Sundays, sometimes Tuesdays, once on a Friday afternoon. The conversations all sounded normal. She asked whether I'd eaten, whether my shoulder was bothering me, whether I'd scheduled my annual physical. Yet every call drifted toward the same place. The cabin must be lonely now. You probably don't get there much. Isn't it expensive to maintain? I bet taxes keep going up. Always gentle, always casual, almost rehearsed. I never accused her, because I didn't believe the words belonged to her. Near the end of March, she invited me over again. This time, Ethan grilled steaks in the backyard despite the cold. He had recently bought a new smoker. He spent 15 minutes explaining how much it had cost. Another 10 explaining why it was an investment instead of an expense. He liked that word. Investment. Everything eventually became one. After dinner, we moved inside. Claire cleared the plates. Ethan stayed with me in the living room. You know, he said while staring into the fireplace. I've been reading about lake properties. Have you? They're worth a fortune now. I've heard. He nodded. If someone waited too long, they could miss the market. I smiled. I'm not following markets. You should. I've reached the age where I follow weather instead. He laughed, a little too loudly. Then he leaned forward. Out of curiosity, here it comes. Has anyone ever appraised the cabin? No. You should. Why? So you know what it's worth. I already do. His eyebrows lifted. You do? To me. For the first time, his smile disappeared. Only for a second. But I saw it. Claire walked back into the room carrying pie. The conversation ended. Yet I noticed something else. When she sat down, Ethan squeezed her hand under the table. Not affection, a signal. She gave the smallest shake of her head, almost impossible to notice. Almost. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m, I found myself standing in the garage. My fishing gear still hung exactly where Evelyn had organized it years ago. The old tackle box. Life jackets. the cedar paddle we no longer used. On the highest shelf sat another cardboard box. Inside were photo albums. Claire at 6 years old, holding a tiny bluegill with both hands. Evelyn laughing behind the camera, the cabin in the background. I smiled despite myself. Then something slipped from between two photographs, a folded piece of paper. Not legal documents, not letters, a hand-drawn map. Claire had made it when she was 8. Crayons, crooked trees, a bright blue lake. And in uneven handwriting, our forever cabin. I sat on the garage floor holding that drawing for a very long time. Some places become valuable because developers discover them. Others become priceless because a child once believed they would last forever. I slipped the drawing back into the album. Then I made a decision. The next time I drove north, I wasn't just checking the roof. I was going to find out who had been coming onto my land. Because deep down, I no longer believed those tire tracks had been there by accident. I didn't expect to catch anyone. I only wanted answers. That Thursday, I left home before sunrise. The highway north was almost empty except for logging trucks and the occasional pickup pulling fishing gear. By the time I reached Pine Hollow Lake, the fog was just beginning to lift from the shoreline. Everything looked peaceful. Too peaceful. I unlocked the cabin, started the generator, opened the windows for a few minutes to let the stale winter air escape. Then I made coffee. It had become a ritual after Evelyn died. One mug, always hers, white ceramic, a tiny blue pine tree painted near the handle. The paint had chipped years ago. I refused to replace it. While the coffee brewed, I walked outside. The eastern side of the property looked normal. No fresh tire tracks, no footprints. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. Around 11:30, I heard an engine, not on the main road, behind the property, the old logging road. I didn't move. The truck stopped exactly where the previous tracks had ended. A silver pickup this time. The driver stayed inside for almost a minute. Then the door opened. A man stepped out carrying a tablet. Not a clipboard, not fishing gear. A tablet. He walked slowly toward the property line, stopped, looked around, tapped something on the screen, then took several photographs. I stayed behind the trees, watching. He wasn't dressed like a hunter or a fisherman. Clean boots, pressed jacket, expensive sunglasses. He looked like someone who spent most of his life indoors. After 10 minutes, he returned to the truck and drove away. I waited another 5 before following the tire marks. They led back toward the county road. Nothing else. No company logo. No license plate I could read. Just another question. On my drive home, I stopped in the small town 15 miles away. There was only one diner, only one gas station, only one hardware store. Places like that notice strangers. The waitress recognized me. "Haven't seen you since fall. I've been busy." She topped off my coffee. "You still keeping up the Mercer place?" "I am," she smiled. "Some fellow was asking about cabins around the lake last week." That got my attention. "What fellow?" She shrugged. "Didn't catch his name." "What did he ask?" "If many owners were thinking about selling." My stomach tightened. "What did you tell him?" "The truth." She smiled. "Most people up there would rather sell their truck than their cabin." I laughed, but only because she expected me to. That evening, my phone rang. Claire. "Hi, Dad." "Hi, sweetheart. Everything okay?" "It is." I called because Ethan found someone who specializes in lake properties. There it was again. Not subtle anymore. I stayed quiet. "He says it wouldn't hurt just to know what the cabin might be worth." "I already know." "Dad, It's worth exactly what your mother thought it was worth. She sighed softly. You know that's not what I mean. I know. Silence. Finally, she spoke again. He's trying to help us plan. For what? Our future. I looked through the kitchen window. Snow was melting from the roof. Water dripped steadily into the flower bed Evelyn used to care for every spring. What future requires knowing the value of my cabin? She didn't answer. Instead, she asked something unexpected. Have you talked to Mr. Rhodes lately? The question caught me off guard. Why? No reason. Claire. Another pause. Ethan wondered if your attorney still handled everything. I closed my eyes. Not because I was angry, because now I knew. The questions weren't random anymore. Someone wanted information. The following Tuesday, Martin called me. I think you should come by. His voice sounded different, less relaxed. I drove over that afternoon. He handed me a single envelope. No return address. When did this arrive? This morning. Inside was a business card. No note, no letter, only a card. North Ridge Land and Development Commercial Acquisitions. On the back, someone had written one sentence. Please call before making any permanent decisions. I looked up. What is this? Martin folded his hands. I've already checked. And? The company has been quietly purchasing lakefront properties across 3 counties. I've never spoken to them. I know. Then why send this to you? Because, he hesitated. They specifically referenced your cabin. A strange feeling settled in my chest. How would they even know about it? I don't know. He leaned back. But I asked a friend who works in county records. What did he find? Someone requested copies of historical parcel maps covering your shoreline. When? 3 weeks ago. The exact week I had found the tire tracks. Can we see who requested them? Martin nodded slowly. We can. He slid another sheet of paper across his desk. The request itself wasn't unusual. People ordered public records every day, but one line near the bottom caught my eye. Requested on behalf of prospective buyer. No company name? Martin shook his head. Only an agent. I looked lower. There was a signature. Messy, almost unreadable, but the address underneath, I recognized immediately. It wasn't an office, it wasn't a business. It was Ethan and Claire's home address. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, I looked at Martin. Maybe there's an explanation. I hope there is. So do I. Because if there wasn't, then someone had started planning the future of my wife's cabin, without ever asking me. I must have read Ethan's address on that request form 10 times. Every time I looked away, I hoped I'd remembered it wrong. I hadn't. Martin let the silence sit between us. Finally, he spoke. Before you assume the worst, I'm trying not to. There may be an innocent explanation. I know. And if there is, don't destroy your relationship with Claire by jumping ahead. I won't. He nodded. Good. Then he reached into another folder. There's something else. I looked up. What? I spent part of this morning checking county filings. And? So far, no one has tried to transfer anything. Relief washed over me. But... He tapped the desk with one finger. There have been inquiries. What kind? Questions about zoning, road access, subdivision restrictions. I stared at him. Those aren't questions someone asks because they're curious. No. They're questions someone asks before making plans. The drive home felt longer than usual. Every mile gave me another chance to make excuses. Maybe Ethan wanted to surprise Claire. Maybe he was only gathering information. Maybe he believed he was helping. People rarely wake up planning to betray someone. Most convince themselves they're being practical. That thought stayed with me all evening. Around 8 o'clock, my phone rang. Claire. Dad? Hi, sweetheart. Are you busy? Never too busy for you. She hesitated. Ethan wants us to invite you over Saturday. What for? He says we'd like to go over some family paperwork together. Family paperwork, another new phrase. I smiled to myself. Sure. Saturday arrived cold and windy. Claire greeted me with a hug. She looked tired, the kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix. Inside, Ethan had spread several folders across the dining room table. Color-coded tabs, legal pads, a laptop already open. He looked almost excited. I'm glad you came. So am I. He handed me a cup of coffee. We've been thinking. I gathered that. He smiled. I asked a financial planner about a state organization. Did you? He had some interesting ideas. Claire remained quiet. She kept folding and unfolding a paper napkin beside her plate. Ethan opened one folder. I made a checklist. He turned it toward me. Primary residence, retirement accounts, vehicles, insurance. Then one line circled in blue ink. Vacation property. You've put a lot of work into this. I like being organized. I can see that. He leaned forward. The biggest issue is the cabin. What issue? If something happened unexpectedly. He paused. Claire could spend months dealing with probate. I've already handled that. His expression barely changed. You have? Years ago. He blinked once. With an attorney? Yes. What attorney? My attorney. I'd love to review the paperwork. No. The answer came easily. Too easily. For the first time since I'd known him. Ethan looked irritated. I'm only trying to help. I know. You don't trust me? I didn't say that. You don't have to. Claire looked up. Ethan, no. He kept his eyes on me. I think this family has a communication problem. I folded my hands. What do you mean? I mean people keeping secrets. The room became very still. I've been part of this family for 5 years. Yes. And I still don't know what's happening with the cabin. I looked at him calmly. That's because nothing is happening. He laughed once, a short laugh. Come on, Tom. I am. You honestly expect me to believe there's no estate plan? I didn't say that either. His smile disappeared. So there is one. I simply looked at him. Sometimes silence tells people more than words. He sat back. Claire finally spoke. Can we stop? Neither of us answered. She looked from him to me. Then quietly said, I don't like where this conversation is going. Lunch ended earlier than anyone expected. Claire walked me to my truck. The wind was stronger now. Dead leaves rolled across the driveway. I'm sorry. You don't have anything to apologize for. She stared at the ground. I didn't know he was going to do that. I believe you. She looked relieved, then worried again. Can I ask you something? Anything. Is there really paperwork? I looked at her for a long moment. There is. About the cabin? Yes. Did Mom know? I smiled. Your mother helped create it, Claire frowned. You never told me. No. Why? Because your mother asked me to wait. She looked genuinely confused. Wait for what? The right time. Before she could ask another question. The front door opened. Ethan stepped outside. You ready? His voice sounded perfectly normal again, like the conversation inside had never happened. Claire nodded. I'll be there. I started the truck. As I backed out of the driveway, I saw them standing together. He said something quietly. She didn't answer. She only looked toward me as I drove away. 2 days later, my security camera sent another alert. Motion detected. 11:42 a.m. I opened the app. A dark SUV rolled slowly past the front of the cabin. It didn't stop. It continued another 100 yards, then backed up. A man stepped out. Same expensive jacket, same tablet. This time he wasn't alone. Another man joined him, older, gray hair. They stood beside the dock, pointing across the shoreline. One of them unfolded a large map. The other measured something with a laser device. Neither man tried to hide what they were doing. They acted as though the property already belonged to someone else. I watched the video 3 times, then paused on one frame. The older man held the map open just long enough for sunlight to catch the company logo. Northridge Land and Development. The same company whose card had arrived at Martin's office. I called him immediately. He answered before the second ring. I was just about to call you. Someone's at the cabin. I know. You know? I received another inquiry this morning. From who? Martin took a slow breath. This one wasn't about buying the property. What was it about? They wanted to know. He stopped for a moment. Whether there were any restrictions preventing the land from being divided into multiple luxury lakefront lots. I closed my eyes. Suddenly, everything made sense. They weren't interested in the cabin. They wanted the land beneath it. And someone had already convinced them it might become available.